and hello to everyone watching the recording of this, whenever that may be, sometime in the future. Hopefully you've all solved the issue of disinformation by then. So I'm going to assume that the people joining us are all from generally the campaigning community. If there's anything specific that you're interested in or work on, feel free to put it in the chat, and I'll try to make things relevant as I go, and then leave plenty of time at the end for questions and discussions. We do have a lot of time, but it is a very dense topic that covers a lot of information. So apologies if I go fairly quickly through very dense material. Now, let me try and share this presentation. Dwayne, you might have to make my presentation the hero shot. Okay, there we go. So Dwayne gave a brief introduction. There's the book I've just written. It's called Facts and Other Lies, which basically gives a broad overview of the history and context of disinformation, and then also an overview of a lot of the solutions, based on my years of campaigning in the progressive space in Australia, America, and around the world. But I was trying to look for a photo of me at an ECF, and I managed to find a video here. This was the last ECF I was at in 2011. And I understand this year is the 20th anniversary of e-campaigning forums. I wish I could be there in Oxford in person. But I was trying to find a picture from this presentation because I remember it featured a picture of George Bush eating a kitten. But I could not find that photo. So you'll just have to imagine George Bush eating a kitten as I go through this the presentation. But it is fantastic to be back in the e-campaigning forum orbit, and hopefully Dwayne might have the video. Hello to any of you who I've met and worked with before, or been at e-campaigning forums in the past. So what is the broad issue that we're talking about when we talk about disinformation? It really relates to how our entire information ecosystem has broken down, and that has so many consequences for our campaigning, because really what we've moved from is a world where people would get their information from good sources. So, for example, here on the left, you see a good source. This is a piece of science which we like, about global temperature rises. But now they get it from what I will call bad sources of information. So here's an example of Donald Trump saying the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. Now, the trouble with this is these two sources of information basically occupy the same real estate in our information ecosystem. Now that our knowledge has moved online and on social media, our brains don't do a very good job of telling the difference between the two. And that's a large reason why we see a lot of the symptoms of disinformation around the world. From a lot of countries have been facing these anti-vaccine and anti-lockdown protests recently. I know in Australia, we had a big convoy of trucks down in our nation's capital. In Canada, they faced something similar in Ottawa. I know New Zealand has been facing the same, and I know in Europe there have been like protests as well. And the people are there with very genuinely held convictions, but it all links back to not just disinformation, but this Trump ecosystem of disinformation that is very much a global problem and not an American problem. But in a campaigning context, I really try to get people to think not just specifically about disinformation, but how this affects us. And the way this affects us is that to win campaigns or to win elections or to win our fact-based reality, you have to control now the digital narrative. And that has become increasingly difficult. So, for example, it can be very fast moving. Novak Djokovic, I'm not sure how big of a story this was around the world, but recently he tried to come to Australia to play in the Australian Open. Good to know. All right, I won't have to recap too many of the details. And of course, he's unvaccinated. And people's opinion on Novak Djokovic changed very quickly. And it's interesting to think about how this happens, because we like to think we're very rational creatures, and we watch the news and we read the newspaper and we get our opinions. But in reality, we form our opinions more by a process of osmosis. So in Australia, we were interacting with the issue of Novak Djokovic through all sorts of different touch points, on social media, with our peers, through WhatsApp or text or phone calls. And then depending on what your pre-existing worldview was, it became related to other issues. So the hotel that Djokovic was locked up in was actually housing a lot of asylum seekers who'd been indefinitely detained in Australia. So for a lot of people, this became an issue about unfair treatment of refugees. But the point is that societies, in Australia at least, our perception of Novak changed very quickly. And this was a digital narrative. Little by little, our peers and on social media, we are forming and rapidly changing our opinions. So this is quite an innocuous example, but this is just as true for any of the issues that we campaign on, whether it's something new that happens in climate change. I'll look at an example with that later, or any other issue that we're working on. So I try to get people to think not about disinformation in the fact that it is disinformation, but whether something is a damaging narrative that has turned into a dominant narrative. So to win an advocacy outcome on any issue, we have to become the dominant narrative on that. And that is hard when disinformation is out there damaging that. So what is the dominant narrative on vaccines? The dominant narrative on vaccines at the moment is that they work and that they're effective and it's a good idea to take them. There is a damaging narrative out there based on disinformation that vaccines don't work or cause harm. And in fact, computer scientists have mapped out how within 10 years, this is likely to become the dominant narrative. So that is the challenge that we're talking about. It's not just about addressing disinformation, because we can get very specific with those solutions. We can say, here is a specific piece of information about vaccines that's wrong. And so I will just correct it with my own fact, and then we'll move on. But we haven't addressed the core issue that we're really talking about, which is preventing that from becoming a dominant narrative. So an example of the difference here, again, taken from Australian politics, we had an election a couple of years ago where one side said the other side was going to introduce a death tax. Now, despite what you think about death taxes, I think they're a great idea. Australia is the only OECD country without a death tax, but it wasn't true. And there was a lot of attention on the damage that this death tax disinformation did on the Labor Party in Australia. But it didn't do damage because of that specific piece of disinformation. So the disinformation was Labor will introduce a death tax, but that's meaningless in a vacuum. That's not going to decide any one person's vote. It is part of a patchwork that makes up a much broader, more complex narrative and how people feel about that. So the problem with that disinformation was that it fed a dominant narrative that Labor will tax you to death. This is a common thing for progressive parties or social democratic parties against conservative parties around the world, that they are high taxing and high spending. And this is actually the sum total of many different proof points. And this is damaging, and this did decide voting intention. So it wasn't about the specific disinformation, it was about the dominant narrative. And Labor in this instance, rather than just attacking, rather than doing what they should have done, which is address that broader narrative about tax and spending, they focused on the specific piece of disinformation, which was trying to feed into that dominant narrative. So it's an important distinction that I want to draw. Now, the other big problem that we need to call out in terms of disinformation is the fact that the Trump-style conservatives dominate. And I can't stress this enough. So I've pulled out a couple of striking examples from the US here. The image on the top right was just any given day on Facebook during the 2020 election. And you can see they calculated share of voice, and that meant all of the political candidates, what percentage of the engagement was around them. And you can see day in, day out, Donald Trump had 90% of the engagement on Facebook, whereas Joe Biden would be languishing in single digits. Yes, the megaphone. Hi, Rachel. How are you doing? That is something a term you can freely borrow and spread. I've found it is a great shorthand for this phenomenon that I'm trying to describe. So you can see that the other image there is this is not a particularly newsworthy day. This was just a random day during that period. And you can see that 8 of the top 10 posts on Facebook on that day were either Trump himself before he got banned from Facebook or the Trump ecosystem. So these names you see there, like Ben Shapiro or Dan Bongino, these are the typical people that make Fox News look reasonable, the really far fringe voices in America. They absolutely dominate. This is the same in Australia. This is the same in Europe. This is the same in any country around there, that these extreme voices on the conservative side of politics are massively favored on social media, and they dominate. So why do they dominate? There's a number of reasons there. One of them is that they are much better at speaking the language of social media. So emotive narratives. They don't speak in terms of facts and figures or in policies, but in terms of outrage and fear and anger. And this is loved by the algorithms. They absolutely love that for engagement. But the other problem that feeds it as well is that they put it into echo chambers. They're very tightly networked, and they are on a mission to spread their own realities, which leads to filter bubbles and these parallel realities. And so they can inhabit these extreme, biased, fringe bubbles and never have any interaction or never encounter any other fact-based reality that we might live in. And they weaponize this. The other thing to think about is just the way that conservatives view the world. So I recommend anyone to look at Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, which is really interesting, which is, everyone is calibrated on different core values and morals. And in general, a conservative brain will calibrate the values quite differently from a progressive or liberal brain. So whereas liberals might calibrate care and harm quite high, a conservative brain might calibrate authority or sanctity quite high. And thanks, Dwayne's just put a link in the chat there. I'm giving a very overview, but the fact is that the way that these extreme fringe voices see the world and communicate their issues is a very good fit for social media, and it is rewarded by the algorithm. Now, the next piece of the puzzle of why that is a problem is what a great academic called Kate Starbird from the University of Washington in America calls participatory disinformation. So the idea that these fringe Trump-style voices are dominated. Some people argue that it comes from the bottom up, and other people argue that it comes from the elites down. And the reality is they are two symbiotic pieces working in harmony with each other. So this is one example of how that works for the big lie, which is the election disinformation in the US after the 2020 election that Trump had actually won, and how that resulted in real world violence. So the audiences might be whipped into a frenzy by the elites to the point where they will have real world violence. And how does that happen? Well, the fake stories, the disinformations can come from anywhere. Sometimes they are real stories that are misinterpreted. Sometimes it's deliberate disinformation. They bubble up. The elites will pounce on them, and they will use violent language to whip the crowd into a frenzy. They will echo those stories back to them. They are hyper-connected on social media in groups that will deliberately amplify them. And they will reinforce that reality. In this case, that reality was the expectation of fraud. So the audiences were primed to see it, and they would rally their audience. And of course, this is what led to the real world violence. So it is this type of vicious circle of how the political elites can weaponize disinformation in tandem with the audiences that they are whipping into a frenzy. So here's an example. I mentioned before I'd use an example about climate change in Australia, and I'm sure again an Australian example that would have gotten a lot of attention in Europe and the UK was the really bad fires that we had in our summer of 2019, and they were devastating. They were a climate-driven event, of course. They were unprecedented. We are having once in 500-year floods at the moment that we also had about 3 years ago, and people are acknowledging now that having these 1 in 1,000-year climate events every few years probably means they're not 1 in 1,000 years anymore. But when the fires hit here, there was this real narrative that went around that they were due to arson, not climate change. And when researchers began to unpack that as to why that was the case and where this came from, they saw the same kind of participatory disinformation. So here you see an article. Now, where is this article appear? This is in the Murdoch press in Australia. So it is a partisan, deliberate political piece of propaganda saying that arson is out there and there's 183 fires. Now, what happens then once the article goes into the real world? Well, it gets picked up on by those voices of the megaphone. And even though this was in Australia, here you see a tweet from Trump Jr., who's taking that piece of disinformation and amplifying it. And then that is the elites. And what happens when the elites are amplifying something like that? Well, it becomes memes. Here is one example, these hyper-connected memes. This is Turning Point USA, which is one of these megaphone groups whose job it is to take these things, turn it into a meme and amplify it on social media. And then where does it go? Back to the conservative media. And in this case, this is again, the Murdoch Fox News style TV channel in Australia. So that is the circle of participatory disinformation. But when we unpack what the origins of that was, you see it started with these hashtags like arson emergency on Twitter. And you can see, let's get this trending. There's a deliberate effort to get this trending. And the graph you can see there is the number of uses of the arson emergency hashtag. And you can see all of a sudden they spike really steeply. And that's not just because that was when the fires were happening. The computer scientists were able to analyze this and found that, of course, this was all bots tweeting the hashtag over and over again. And so that's where we got the media stories from, the memes, the Donald Trump Jr. tweeting it. And so the cycle continues. And that became a very damaging narrative in Australia. And a lot of the conversation became, well, why are people trying to politicize this around climate change when obviously this is due to arson, not climate change? And that was exactly what was intended to happen. So I think this is a similar example that many people listening to this might face on their own issue. We are vulnerable to these sorts of disinformation campaigns against our issues. So how are we so vulnerable to this type of manipulation? Unfortunately, it has a lot to do with our brains. Our task as campaigners is not to rewire 10,000 years plus of human evolution and cognitive bias, but we do have to understand how it is those biases that really allow disinformation to manipulate us and manipulate our audiences and drive these damaging narratives. So there's a number of reasons why, and the psychology on this is fascinating. I will give the book a plug because I go into quite a lot of depth, and it's really fascinating stuff. I'm not a psychologist. I learned a lot about it, and I think it's fundamental to our understanding of disinformation. And the key understanding we've got to have is that our brains simply don't care about truth. They have much bigger fish to fry. What do we care about? We care about fitting in. We care about what our peers think. We care about protecting our pre-existing opinions against information. If something challenges a piece of our identity, then we become very hostile to that information. So if you are someone who is in one of these tightly bound groups who have become hostile to lockdown measures and vaccines, then you become tightly bonded to the peers who agree with you and very hostile to any information that might contradict your beliefs, like vaccines work or lockdown measures are an effective tool of suppression or public health. And so all of that really means that facts don't cure falsehoods. And this is a fundamental misunderstanding that a lot of people have. The default response to disinformation is to put facts out there to correct the falsehood. And unfortunately, disinformation is so effective because that just doesn't work. We are in a competitive space for ideas when we campaign. We are trying to have people form opinions in a contested space. And if they are hostile to our opinions on the issue we're campaigning on, they will happily ignore facts and contort them to mean the opposite of what they mean, or to mean something that supports their worldview, or at least allows them to ignore it so they can keep their worldview current. And unfortunately, the other reason why this works is social media, as we saw with the megaphone, really reinforces this. Social media and the internet are platforms that play into our cognitive biases. They piggyback on those thousands of years of evolution that made our brains not care about whether something is true or false. Our brains are also very lazy, which makes this harder. We don't want to do any hard mental work. We want to just believe anything we see, and we want our subconscious to fit it into what we think, rather than having to do the taxing mental labor. Now, this tweet, if you can see it there, is a wonderful example of this. I still think my favorite thing that's ever happened to me on the internet is the time a guy said, people change their minds when you show them facts. And I said, actually, studies show that's not true, and linked 2 sources. And he said, yeah, well, I still think it works. So there's a perfect example, apocryphal or not, of this in the real world. So we're gonna get into more detail on some of those solutions I've touched on there. But first, I think it's important to listen to our friend Vanilla Ice when he said, "Stop, collaborate, and listen." When thinking about disinformation, one of the most important things we need to remember is that often the best response, for those reasons I just discussed about the brain, is to do nothing. So responding to disinformation, as I'll explain a little bit later, can sometimes be counterproductive. So we have to have a way to determine what the tipping point is, whether or not we will respond. So depending on your context, if you're fighting a political campaign, or if you are working on a particularly sensitive issue that's facing a lot of disinformation, or is prone to conspiracy theories and really harmful disinformation out there, you'll need to have some kind of decision-making matrix that identifies a tipping point, when you will respond, and then how you'll respond. And a couple of the tools that are really helpful for that are social listening tools first to identify it, and then some kind of research tracking in order to monitor what your audience's exposure is to any disinformation. So a good example of this is actually the Biden campaign in the US. And apologies, Dwayne, I know we were talking before this call about how we always use US examples, but they really are. Trump really did make the US the ground zero for disinformation, and the Biden campaign really had to operationalize something that led to some useful models for other campaigners. So they started something called the Malarkey Factory. Malarkey being an old-timey word in America for bullshit. And here's a very rudimentary kind of map I drew of how it worked. The first thing, a piece of disinformation is out there. The next phase is spotting it. How do we identify disinformation? Social listening tools, one thing, the Biden campaign, but also some custom DNC tech. Now, here's the important part of what they did. Rather than just respond to all of the disinformation out there, which was voluminous, Trump, 70% of everything Trump said in the 2016 campaign was disinformation. So the 2020 campaign, I'm sure, was a similar number. So what do you do then? Well, the two questions that the Biden campaign asked was, is it credible? And if so, with our target audiences. So they need to meet that tipping point I was mentioning, that vanilla ice, that stop, collaborate, and listen, of, is this doing harm to voters that we care about? So, for example, they found some of the most high-profile disinformation, like about Hunter Biden and some of his indiscretions, was getting a lot of attention, but they found it wasn't moving their persuasion audiences, so they ignored it. Whereas some other disinformation wasn't getting a lot of attention, but it was particularly effective, like Biden having cognitive decline, they found was very effective. And so that would trigger a response. Now, what was the response? They would focus group it, they would put it into their research track, and then they would conduct message testing on Facebook at volume in order to find something that inoculated people against it, and then put that into their content streams and advertising streams and get it to those identified audiences that had been exposed to it, rather than putting it out there far and wide. And I tried to map that a little bit to show how that was also a bit of a cycle. They built very complex audience persona profiles that were built not just on demographics, but on who had been exposed to a piece of disinformation, which they knew through their research polling. And then they built content based on those behaviors, on focus groups. They put it in the in-flight testing, and they were constantly iterating and then serving that inoculative content. So one good thing we can learn from the Biden campaign in terms of their response to disinformation was really having a clear tipping point for a response, and then a very robust process for getting the right content, testing whether it works, and making sure it was only going to the right people. Now, they didn't do everything right, so I'll also use them as an example of what not to do. So here are the common things that we found don't really work when addressing disinformation. I'll jump down to number one we've discussed when we talked about the brain. Facts. We like to think that we're rational. We like to think that that facts will cure falsehoods, but unfortunately, at least on their own, they don't do a great job. The other thing that we often do is negate. So what is negating? Well, here's some examples from the Biden campaign where he didn't do the right thing. Negating is saying, I will not do this, or I am not a crook, or I will never defund the police. So here you see Joe Biden won't ban fracking. And there was some disinformation going around about him raising taxes for people who made under $400,000 a year. And what did he do? He put out content saying, I won't raise your taxes if you make under $400,000 a year. Now, the problem with that is people only hear what you won't do. And now all of a sudden I'm worried that Joe Biden will raise my taxes if I make under $400,000 a year. So it just reinforces the negative frame. The other thing that doesn't work is amplifying it. And this is what we see, especially if we call something out on social media. That just favors the algorithm. And labeling doesn't work. So you see the platforms often do this. And unfortunately, labeling has been found to be a bit of a red flag that draws people's attention to disinformation. But also, even when they found it works, it makes people think that anything without a label must therefore be true because they've seen disinformation labeled. Now, because the labeling is a very label-intensive purpose, a lot of disinformation isn't labeled, but that makes people think it's true because it doesn't have a label. So here's a good example of amplification. This is Barbara Streisand's house in California. There she is. And the only reason I know that is because she tried to keep it a secret. And this photo was from a very obscure California website that was mapping coastal erosion. And for some reason, Barbara Streisand's people found it and they said, please take down this photo because we don't want this to be public. And in fact, we're going to sue you. And as a result of that lawsuit, everybody now knows what Barbara Streisand's house looks like. Before the lawsuit, it had only been downloaded 8 times, and 6 of those were by Barbara Streisand's legal team as part of the case. So they call this in communications the Barbara Streisand effect, that in trying to draw attention to, in trying to prevent something from having any oxygen, you just draw more attention to it. So this is the big problem with disinformation. If you are facing a malicious attack and your response is to complain through a media strategy or to highlight it on Facebook, share it with your supporters saying, do not believe this rumor, of course, you are just spreading that rumor. You are amplifying the disinformation far and wide. And likewise, when we engage with it, Craig Kelly here is someone who was too extreme for our extreme conservatives here and too extreme for Facebook. It would spread all sorts of harmful disinformation, very Trump-style disinformation. You can see here, thank you, lefty trolls. Every time you post a comment, this helps with the Facebook algorithms and results in the facts, read disinformation, in my posts appearing on more and more people's newsfeed. Please keep up the good work. And what do we see? 2.6 thousand people commented on that. And as Craig Kelly predicted, that just favored that piece of content in the algorithm and led to more attention on it. Now, the other problem we've got to acknowledge here is what we call the intensity gap. And depending on what issues you all work on, you may have encountered this. I have most directly dealt with this working on gun control in the US. Very tough and depressing issue to campaign on. And you can see here from this bar graph, if you can't read it, it says that 90% of Trump voters support universal background checks. So this is the problem in America, is that even 90% of Trump voters and a similar number of gun owners support background checks. But the 10% of people who don't are way more passionate about it, way more vocal about it. And you'll see they can take to the streets in these sorts of protests. And what is the result of that? Well, the 10% wins. They don't have universal background checks in America because the 10% is so vocal and so intense and passionate in their support. Now, what does this have to do with disinformation? Now, the reason why you see, the pandemic framed as, a large group of society being very against public health measures is the same thing. When you look at a country like Australia, has about 95% vaccination rate against COVID. But that 5% are so passionate and so vocal about it. It seems like a really even contest of ideas. Climate change is the same. The overwhelming majority of scientists, but the people who and the groups who are opposed to action on climate change are the tiny minority, but they're so vocal about it. So this is a big part of disinformation. The people who spread conspiracy theories and damaging narratives might be small in number, but they are so passionate. They're on a deliberate mission to spread their disinformation. So what does work? Well, here's the good news. We have been able to find some things that work against disinformation. And first and foremost, speaking of a vaccine, you can likewise inoculate against COVID, against disinformation rather, as you can against COVID. And we call that pre-bunking. Here's a picture of the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who was announcing the election in that country. And she got up and said, I commit to a truthful campaign. There's going to be all sorts of disinformation out there. It's very damaging to society and very harmful. And here's what to look out for. That was a very effective form of pre-bunking. They've done studies to show that the more you warn in general about disinformation, the less likely people will be to share it, and the better able they are to recognize it when they see it. I'll touch on that in a second as well. The other thing that works is a faster, stronger narrative. So first of all, we need to get to people's brains first. That is the other piece of psychology I didn't mention, is the brain will favor whatever information takes up residence first, and it's very hard to dislodge. So once we are talking to an audience who believes something false about our issue or our campaign, it's very hard to correct their perception. But if we can get to them first with our truth, then they will be much more impervious to the disinformation. Now, also having a stronger narrative helps. So telling a better story, being more engaging rather than the really engaging disinformation out there. So if we can get those strong narratives out there quickly before disinformation hits, that is by far and away our most effective weapon against it. So this headline here is one example from before the 2020 election in the US, where they knew that there was a lot of disinformation coming around mail-in ballots and early voting, which we all saw was the case. And so they went out there first with a positive factual alternative in advance of the disinformation. Colorado's mail-in ballot system is safe. So the more that people could believe that and form that as reality, the more impervious they were to disinformation, that it was susceptible to fraud. So warning people about it, I'll expand on that in a second. And also putting things in a fact sandwich. If something does meet the tipping point and we do have to respond to disinformation, then we need to surround it by facts on either side of it. So I call that a fact sandwich. Yes, Rachel, that is a great example of that inoculation. The US was out there before the Russian invasion saying there will be a false flag attack. Watch out for this false flag attack in the Ukraine. So that had a false flag attack occur, which in fact did, they did try this, then people would say, I recognize what's going on. That is what I've been warned about. That is Russian disinformation. It fed into an idea that already formed. Now, if the US hadn't formed that piece of inoculation, the first thing they would have encountered was a contested news space of some attack that had happened and Ukrainians had been blamed or whatever the narrative was. And if that was the first information they heard, and then subsequently they were introduced the idea that this was a false flag attack and disinformation, there's much rockier ground. They might not be willing to believe that. You might think this with old wives' tales that you might have heard as a kid, where subconsciously you might, it's not true, but you still can't help thinking it. That's just how our brains work. So the fact sandwich is basically if we had to respond to an idea like that false flag attack, and we don't want to amplify it, you start with the truth, which in this instance might be, a positive alternative, the Ukrainian forces respect territorial integrity. You might have heard something to the contrary, and then you warn that the disinformation is coming. Then you mention what it is, and then you repeat the positive truth afterwards. So the idea is you never want to leave a piece of disinformation in isolation, hanging out there by itself, because it might be picked up by someone's brain. So there are a couple of different forms of inoculation, and one of them I've mentioned about getting out there with your truthful alternative first. So the Ukraine example of the false flag attack is a good piece where you're expecting specific disinformation. Get the truth out there and warn about it in advance. If you're campaigning on a tax justice campaign, and you know what types of arguments you're going to face and what types of disinformation you're going to face, get out there with your positive factual reality first about tax evasion, so that your audiences will be more impervious. Now, the other thing, these three screenshots here are one of the most promising examples of a study that has proved this inoculation works. They're all different versions of online games, and your goal is to win followers by spreading disinformation, and it's an innocuous form of disinformation. And so, bad news was the first one there, and there's been a few iterations, including one about the pandemic. And you are a character, and you've got to pull out all the same tricks that people do, like having a very emotive narrative or fueling outrage based on a rumor, and all those sorts of tricks, and it's all a lot of fun. Now, the studies have shown they've had tens of thousands of people play these games since, and consistently across the political spectrum, across every demographic, people who have played this game are much better at detecting disinformation and much less likely to share it when they see it. And the theory is just the same as the vaccine. They have been exposed to weakened doses, they have thought about it, and they have produced mental antibodies against it in the process, so that when they see disinformation, their mental antibodies give that protective layer against the disinformation. So another really good example is some researchers took a bunch of people, and they showed them information about tobacco misinformation, trying to bury the link between smoking and cancer in the 50s and 60s. And they said, here's how the tobacco companies did it. Here's the sorts of tricks they used. And here's how they spread disinformation to pretend that smoking didn't cause cancer. Now, subsequently, they took those participants and they showed them climate change disinformation. And they were all much better able to recognize it because they recognized the tactics that they'd learnt about. They saw what the tobacco companies did, and they recognized the same type of junk science tactics. And so they had been inoculated against disinformation. Now, the other form of inoculation is to think about who specifically will be spreading your disinformation. So is there a particular high-profile person that will attack your campaign or issue and spread lies? And normally we know where they're going to come from. So research has shown that if you can do brand damage to those messengers, their disinformation is less effective. And it doesn't have to be about that. In Australia, one of the guys who spreads all the Trump-style disinformation, turns out he had a mine that wasn't paying his workers. People hated that. And once they found out he hadn't paid his workers, his disinformation was a lot less effective. So damaging the brand is another way to inoculate against it. Now, changing someone's mind who's been exposed is incredibly difficult to do. But again, it's important for campaigns to think about how to do that. There's a few ways to go about it. The first is to argue in someone's value frame. So normally when we speaking to people who are sharing disinformation, we want to mock them and we want to point out just how wrong they are in order to point out just how right we are. Now, unfortunately, that just engages different parts of their brains, which makes them more resilient to our changing of their minds and less likely to do so. So we need to look for the overlap in values. Now, look at the pandemic and the disinformation as a good example. You know, if you're speaking to someone who is out there protesting against vaccines, maybe the best thing to do is to focus on a shared value around protecting people's health. You know, they come to it from a genuine value of being concerned for kids' health. We all share that value, and let's connect there and start there before we get to the point of difference. Form that overlapping common purpose. The other thing to do is to lower the stakes. So we often have to, we're asking people to point out, to admit that they're stupid in order to be corrected when we mock something. Now, obviously, we're not going to do that because that's a really high bar to jump over. But we're also not going to do that in public. When we do something on social media or in a public forum, the incentive is to be right. When we do it in private, the incentive is to find consensus. So can we find a way to take chats out of the public sphere and into the private domain where we can have those genuine conversations? The other thing that we can do is pique people's curiosity. So this is why clickbait works. So you can see the example on the right. Leading doctor reveals the number one worst carb you are eating. Now, all your brain wants to do is find out what that carb is. And you have opened your mind to the possibility of learning something. If that headline had said, now I don't know what the worst carb is, maybe it's a piece of white bread. If that headline had said, white bread is causing cancer, or white bread is the worst carb you could eat, maybe you really like white bread and you become hostile to that. Or at very least, you assess it against what you already think. Oh, I don't think that's true. I think it's potatoes, and you're using a different part of your brain. That's why clickbait works. So studies have shown if you pique someone's scientific curiosity about something like climate change, you're much more likely to convince them about something than if you are presenting it as a fact. You want to open people's minds to the possibility of being surprised and learning something. And when we frame our arguments in terms of beating someone over the head with a fact, it doesn't happen. And the other way you change someone's mind is it can be done peer-to-peer. So people respond to their peers, and if you can find someone from the affected community that you are trying to change the mind of, then obviously that will be much more effective. Now, specifically, what can campaigning organisations and movements do in the space of disinformation? Now, one of the first things that's really important is how we tell our stories and addressing that intensity gap. Can we bring as much passion to our fact-based information and realities and campaigns as people who spread disinformation do? Can we make that as engaging as a conspiracy theory? QAnon has such appeal because it just reads like a Hollywood script, whereas quite often facts are left to speak for themselves. So we have to get better at bringing passion to that kind of storytelling. And then we have to do something else that the Trump megaphone does, and that is recreate our echo chambers. And that's not in terms of closing our supporters' minds off to outside thought. It's about connecting them and making them deliberately share our content and campaign as if the campaign depends on it and the impact depends on it, because it does. This is something that people on the disinformation side of the ledger do incredibly well. They're not competitive about who's telling the story. They want to get it trending, and they want to spread it as far and wide as possible. And they organize to do so. So we need to organize to do so as well. The other thing we can do is to train our supporters or members, depending on what type of organization you are, to have those types of conversations I spoke about on the last slide, and to give them the tools to engage their peers into well-intentioned conversations. Now, really promising stuff that some of you might have heard of coming out of the field organizing world is deep canvassing. And without going into too much detail here, they basically found that going and door knocking and telling someone, here's what I think you should agree with me is terribly ineffective. But going and knocking on someone's door and sitting there and listening to them for half an hour is actually incredibly effective in changing that person's mind. So we can create and share resources in terms of mobilizing supporters to do this. That would be fundamentally important in addressing disinformation. The other thing we can do is in terms of how we respond on our issues when they're attacked, in terms of not falling into some of those traps that we spoke of, and getting out there instead with our positive alternative. And the last thing, which goes without saying, is that a lot of the stuff I've talked about is a problem because this type of information ecosystem has filled a void that was created by the erosion of publicly funded news and investigative journalism. So if we want to have a level playing field between all ideas where our campaigns can win a dominant narrative and win progress on our issues, that will be very hard to do if we cannot defend the healthy information ecosystem that allows us to do that. Okay, I went a little bit longer than I was intending, but I saw some great comments in the chat and a couple of excellent articles linked there. There's a bunch of resources that I've tried to compile as well. Let me see if I can find that link and drop it in there. Dwayne, happy to hand back over to you.
Sure, yeah. So I've just put a link into your site, and so if you want to deep links, more specific resources, then I'll leave it up to you. I guess there was a question Rachel raised, which is early on, which is what's the citation? Early on, you mentioned a citation about computer science have worked out for that in 10 years, the dominant narrative will become anti-vax. And she was asking for a citation for that.
Yeah, I will give you the citation. While I found that, let me here we go. Explain more about what they found, which is really there you go. I knew it was a good idea to have a footnotes section of my website so I could easily find citations. Basically what they did is they mapped out how clusters were working, and they saw anti-vaccination clusters, neutral clusters, and pro-vaccination clusters. And at the moment, obviously, pro-vaccination clusters are dominant, but they saw that the anti-vaccination clusters were aggressively convincing neutral clusters. And that's what they were able to map over time, that because of the way that the ways I've talked about how disinformation passionately is on a mission to spread, they could see that from a computer science analysis point of view about the trends continuing in that. So that is the onus on us to match some of the tactics that people who spread disinformation do, because otherwise we don't evangelize our ideas and we don't convince more people of our ideas. And so they are only left to be convinced by people spreading disinformation. So very scary study, but fascinating to think about how we bring that to campaigning. Oh, you're muted, Dwayne.
So thanks very much, and also ask others to ask questions sort of as you have them. I've got one about sort of if you have any good examples of progressive NGOs campaigns dealing with disinformation.
Yeah, I think it depends on what sort of area we're talking about. So, this is a kind of society-wide response. And so I think there's been some good stuff that has come out of the States where you can respond in terms of Facebook advertising at volume, and to try and get out there and pre-bunk with your alternative truth. So I know that in the 2020 election, for example, Acronym, I don't know if folks are familiar with them, a Democratic-aligned PAC, really wanted to frame the Trump's response to the coronavirus negatively. And they were able to do some good research and analysis on their own work, finding that by getting out there really quickly and filling that persuasion window, they were able to move the needle with undecided voters there. So that's the dominant narrative. Now, in terms of addressing disinformation, there is a lot of great work going on with a group called First Draft, who do a lot of work, especially with journalists, and have created a lot of good resources and have tried to put that into the real world, like with the tipping point, for example. They're active in a Brazilian election and the French election, where they found that they managed to time that response to disinformation really well, where they'd analysed the correct tipping point. And then there's the good storytellers who are out there trying to frame good content. I think the example I'll highlight at the moment is the Ukrainian government. There is led by donkeys. Thank you, Rachel. They're a great example of that form of inoculation, of getting out there on the front foot with very good brand damage and also engaging content. The Ukrainian response to the Russian invasion has acknowledged that we are in a competition for that digital narrative, and how do you fight Russian disinformation when it's an existential threat? You win the digital narrative. They know it's as important as what's happening on the ground. And there is some amazing content that is coming out of Ukraine. And it feeds into our cognitive biases in the same way that disinformation is so effective. There's a video doing the rounds yesterday, which was just very emotive content. I'll see if I can dig up the link. And more than that, it's just simple, not high production value, a steady stream of President Zelensky walking the streets, or defiant Ukrainians out there. That example I led this presentation off about Novak Djokovic is, how do I form my opinions about a rapidly developing issue? And I'm someone who, my reality is, Russia is the aggressor. I abhor their action. So someone like me sees all of those points of content, and I absorb them by osmosis of reinforcing my worldview, and they have solidified my opinions towards that conflict. And it's been a very sophisticated example of how to win that battle for the narrative in real time when faced with disinformation saying the opposite.
Great, thanks, Ed. I've just shared a link also to confirmation bias, which I think was what you're referring to.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Now we've got to the point where we're at so just after 12. I realize some others may have other meetings to go to, but I want to just check if there's any final questions. We've had some from Alistair and Rachel. There's a few more of you on the stream. Joelle, anything else to ask? Just give it a sec. Now, so this video will be available afterwards. I'm going to be sharing it. And also, Ed, I'll give you a copy so you can edit out and cut out cut out the beginning bit where we're sort of welcoming everybody, and you can put it on your sites as well. I want to actually thank you for this. It's been actually amazing. I know you said you could go on for a lot longer. That's why you wrote a book, which can be ordered. There's a delivery, I think, right now from Australia, because the digital rights, or the any rights, have not been determined outside of Australia right now. But it can be shipped here for anywhere you want for a reasonable price. I will put a link on as well. There's a link on, if you follow the presentation background and resources under the section about Ed, there should be a section, a link to buying it if you want to get it worldwide. And I think, Ed, you'll also update us when the when the podcast comes available, or the the audio book, or the PDF version available for distribution worldwide as well, because I think people would find it very useful, because I think we're all facing some of the same challenges and frustrations with campaigning.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me, Dwayne. It's really great to be back in the ECF orbit. Yes, international rights move very slowly for for books, but for those hanging out for the Kindle or audiobook version. But thanks everyone, and feel free to reach out specifically about any particular disinformation you're facing on your own issues or campaigns.
You want me to share your email address in the chat here? So
yeah, please.
So there it is there. Super. Well, thanks very much for your time. I know it's sort of late in the evening there. You've got kids in bed. I see some of the paintings up beside you there, beside your book, Place of Pride. So yeah, thanks for your time on this, and also for the relatively short notice, organized in about a week or two. And hopefully we get more of what you've found out to the community and beyond, so we can deal effectively with disinformation, which is I've always found to be a challenge as well.
Thanks, Dwayne. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.